I never thought much about the old store at the edge of town. It had been there for as long as I could remember, a dimly lit place with aisles packed so tightly you had to squeeze past shelves that seemed ready to collapse under the weight of forgotten goods. The sign above the entrance had long since faded, the letters barely legible, as if the place itself had given up on trying to draw customers in. Yet, for some reason, it remained open, a fixture in our town that no one ever talked about. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself in desperate need of a few groceries. Every other store had already closed, leaving me with no choice but to step inside that eerie old shop. The bell above the door gave a feeble jingle, announcing my arrival. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust and something else, something stale, almost rotten. I made my way through the narrow aisles, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the unnerving silence. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast long, twitching shadows that seemed to stretch and recoil as I moved. I felt an odd sensation, as if someone, or something, was watching me, just out of sight. At the counter stood an old man, his features gaunt and hollow. His milky eyes followed me without a word. I gave a small nod, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, and quickly grabbed the items I needed. As I approached the register, the man finally spoke. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "You shouldn't be here this late." I forced a chuckle. "Yeah, I know. Didn't have much of a choice." He didn't smile. Instead, he reached under the counter and placed a small, dust-covered package in front of me. The wrapping was yellowed with age, the paper brittle. "Take this," he said. "Don't open it here." Confused, I hesitated, then picked it up. "What is it?" "Just go," he murmured, his gaze darting toward the aisles behind me. "Now." A shiver ran through me. Something in his voice, an urgency that couldn't be ignored, set my nerves on edge. I didn't argue. I paid for my things, gripping the strange package tightly as I pushed out into the night. The moment I stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter, cleaner, as if I had escaped something suffocating. I hurried home, the package burning a hole in my curiosity. As soon as I was inside, I locked the door and turned on every light in my apartment before setting the mysterious parcel on my kitchen table. My fingers trembled as I unwrapped the brittle paper. Inside was an old photograph, yellowed with time. My breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of the store's interior, taken decades ago. The shelves were neater, the lights brighter. But it wasn't the store itself that made my blood run cold. It was the figures in the image. Customers stood frozen in time, their faces turned toward the camera. Their expressions were twisted in horror, mouths open in silent screams. But what chilled me to the core was that I recognized them. Every single one. They were the missing people from our town, the ones who had vanished without a trace over the years. Their names had faded from conversation, their disappearances left unexplained. And then, at the very edge of the photo, almost out of frame, was a blurry figure. My stomach dropped. It was me. A sharp knock rattled my door. My heart pounded against my ribs as I turned toward the sound. Another knock, louder this time. I backed away, my pulse racing. Then, from behind me, the familiar jingle of a bell echoed through my apartment. The store's entrance bell. I wasn't home anymore. I was back inside the store. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The walls of my apartment had vanished. In their place stood the cramped, suffocating aisles of the old store. The flickering fluorescent lights above buzzed like a swarm of dying insects, casting jittery, unnatural shadows. The photograph was still in my hands, but the image had changed. The store's shelves were bare now, empty except for a thick, writhing darkness pooling where products should have been. The people, the missing ones, were no longer frozen in terror. They had moved. Their wide, vacant eyes now stared directly at me. A sharp whisper slithered through the silence, coming from behind one of the aisles. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I wasn't alone. I took a shaky step forward, the warped linoleum floor groaning beneath my weight. The store seemed to stretch, the aisles elongating, shifting. My stomach churned as I realized the exit was gone. The front door, the dirty windows, everything had vanished. I was trapped. The whisper came again, closer this time. My name. I whirled around. The old man stood at the register, but his gaunt face was wrong. His mouth stretched too wide, curling into a grotesque smile. His milky eyes rolled unnaturally in their sockets, as if searching for something unseen. His voice, when it came, was layered, as though more than one person was speaking through him. You shouldn't have opened it. The photograph in my hands grew heavier, and suddenly, the faces in the picture twisted further. Their mouths opened wider, too wide. They weren't screaming anymore. They were laughing. A slow, deliberate scrape echoed through the store, the sound of something sharp dragging against metal. My breath hitched as a tall, spindly figure stepped into the aisle ahead. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers too many, all curling and twitching. Its face was featureless, except for a gaping hole where a mouth should be. It took a step toward me. Then another. I stumbled backward, slamming into a shelf. The items rattled but did not fall. The store wasn't real, and yet the terror clawing at my chest was. I turned and ran, weaving through the aisles, but the layout was wrong now. Paths twisted into each other like a maze, looping back in impossible ways. Every time I turned a corner, I found myself right back where I started, facing that thing. The lights overhead flickered faster, casting the store in erratic bursts of brightness and dark. With each flash, the creature was closer. Then, the lights cut out completely. Silence. A breath, not mine, whispered against my ear. Stay. I screamed, thrashing blindly in the dark. My fingers clawed at nothingness. The air was thick, suffocating. I was drowning in the dark. Then. A blinding light exploded around me. I gasped, stumbling forward onto hard pavement. Cold night air filled my lungs, sharp and real. The store was gone. I was standing outside, the package crumpled in my shaking hands. The photograph was gone. The street was empty. Silent. But the sign above the old store's door, the one that had been too faded to read before, now glowed with fresh, red letters. Welcome back. The door creaked open on its own. And from deep inside, the bell jingled again. Somewhere, in the darkness of the store, something was waiting. The pavement beneath me suddenly felt wrong. Cold, too cold. My breath misted in the air, though it wasn't winter. A thick fog coiled around my ankles, creeping toward me like grasping fingers. The streetlights flickered violently before popping, one by one, casting everything into deeper shadow. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through my bones. Then, a voice. Multiple voices, whispering in unison. They slithered through my mind, drowning out rational thought. Why did you leave? I turned sharply, but the street behind me was gone. The town had vanished, swallowed by a void of nothingness. All that remained was the store, standing in the dark like a beacon of doom. The ground beneath me trembled. A gnarled hand shot out of the fog, grabbing my ankle with impossible strength. I screamed, kicking at it, but another hand emerged. And another. Clawing, pulling. A chorus of laughter, high-pitched, guttural, inhuman, filled the air as I was dragged toward the entrance. The door yawned open, revealing a gaping void inside. Shadows pulsed, shifting like living things, waiting. My nails scraped against the pavement as I fought, but the store would not be denied. I was yanked inside. The bell gave one last jingle before the door slammed shut behind me. Darkness. Silence. Then, in the void, a flickering light blinked to life. I was standing in an aisle again. The shelves were full this time. But instead of food or supplies, they were lined with jars. Each one contained something moving. Something writhing. Faces pressed against the glass from within, their mouths open in silent screams. I staggered backward, my breath shallow. My own reflection stared at me from one of the jars. The old man's voice rasped in my ear, close enough to feel his breath. "Welcome home." The lights went out. Darkness swallowed me whole. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no air, no escape. Just the void, thick and smothering, pressing against my skin like a living thing. Then, suddenly, the lights flared back to life, buzzing dimly overhead. My breath hitched. The store stood before me once more, identical to how I had left it all those years ago. Except this time, there were no exits. I turned in frantic circles. No door. No windows. The shelves stretched endlessly in every direction, warping and shifting whenever I looked away. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and something metallic, blood. My stomach twisted as I stared at the jars lining the shelves. They pulsed, the faces inside writhing and distorting as if trying to break free. A whisper drifted through the aisles. "Welcome home." The old man's voice curled around my spine like ice. I spun, but there was no one there. Only more shelves. More jars. More trapped souls. Then the lights flickered again. A new sound rose, low and guttural, crawling through the store like a swarm of insects. Something was breathing in the darkness. Heavy, rasping breaths that came closer with each passing second. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I took a step back, and bumped into something solid. A hand clamped around my wrist. I screamed, jerking away, but the grip tightened. My gaze snapped up, and I was met with a nightmare. The old man stood before me, his face warped and shifting like a melted candle. His eyes were hollow pits, his mouth an abyss lined with jagged teeth. His fingers elongated, digging into my skin as he pulled me closer. "You never should have left," he whispered, his breath reeking of decay. "You belong here." I thrashed wildly, but the store itself seemed to conspire against me. The shelves closed in, towering higher, blocking every path. The lights overhead flickered violently, casting monstrous shadows that slithered along the floor. The laughter returned, rising in volume, echoing from every direction. The jars rattled on the shelves. Then, one by one, they shattered. The souls inside burst free, not into salvation, but into grotesque, writhing masses of flesh. They crawled toward me, their bodies unfinished, limbs twisting at unnatural angles. Their mouths opened wide, too wide, revealing rows of teeth that clacked together as they whispered my name. "Come back. Come back. Come back." I turned to run, but my feet refused to move. Hands, so many hands, shot out from the ground, grabbing my ankles, my arms, my throat. They dragged me downward, pulling me into the cold, unyielding floor as if it were liquid. I clawed at the ground, my nails peeling back as I fought to hold on. "No. No, please." I sobbed, struggling, but it was no use. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the old man's face looming above, splitting into a grotesque grin. Then I was falling. When I woke, I was in the store again. The shelves were neat. The jars were whole. The lights buzzed gently overhead. The air was still, undisturbed. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. Then I looked down. My hands pressed against the smooth glass of a jar. I was inside, trapped, my reflection distorted by the curved surface. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I pounded against the glass, but it was useless. Beyond my prison, the store remained unchanged, untouched by time. The aisle stretched endlessly, waiting. And then, just beyond the shelves, the door jingled. Someone had entered. A new visitor. A new soul. And I could only watch as the store prepared to claim another. Outside, a police cruiser rolled to a stop in front of the abandoned store. Officer Grant stepped out, frowning as he scanned the dilapidated facade. The place had been closed for years, yet dispatch had received reports of lights flickering inside. His German shepherd, Max, leapt down from the passenger seat, sniffing the air before letting out a low growl. "Easy, boy," Grant muttered, but unease crept into his gut. He approached the entrance and tested the door. It swung open with an eerie creak. The store was empty, shelves coated in dust, air thick with an unnatural stillness. Then Max whined, stepping backward, ears flat. The dog's hackles bristled, eyes locked on something deeper within the store. A single jar sat on a shelf, pristine among the decay. Inside, something moved. A face. A screaming face. Grant's breath caught in his throat as he took a step closer. The reflection inside the jar shifted, twisted. It was his own face staring back at him. The door slammed shut behind him. Officer Grant's pulse pounded in his ears. The jar sat motionless on the dusty shelf, yet the reflection inside twisted, writhing, mirroring his every move. His breath came in shallow gasps as he took an unsteady step forward, drawn in by the impossible sight. Max whimpered, his tail tucked between his legs. The dog had never shown fear before, not even in the face of death. But now, he shrank back, low growls rumbling from his throat. "Stay," Grant whispered, though his voice barely carried. His gut screamed at him to turn around, to leave, to run, but something unseen gripped him, pulling him deeper into the store. His fingers trembled as they reached toward the jar. Just as his skin brushed the cool glass. The lights flickered. A whisper slithered through the aisles, curling around him like invisible fingers. "Welcome home." Grant spun, his hand going to his holster. But there was no one there. Only the shelves, stretching endlessly, twisting in ways that defied logic. The exit was gone. His cruiser, the outside world, it had never been there. Just the store. Just the dark. A guttural breathing filled the silence, heavy and rasping, coming from every direction. The shadows slithered along the floor, shifting, coiling. Max whined and bolted, disappearing between the aisles. "Max!" Grant's voice cracked. He tried to run after him, but the floor was no longer solid. It felt like wet cement, gripping his boots, dragging him down. He yanked his foot free with a grunt, forcing himself forward. The jars rattled. The faces inside twisted, their eyes darting frantically, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. The whispers turned into wails, a chorus of the damned crying out in agony. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and something metallic, blood. Then, a single jar shattered. Grant flinched as glass rained down. A hand, skeletal and slick with black ichor, clawed its way from the shards, followed by another, and another. The thing that emerged was wrong, its limbs too long, its face a shifting mass of human features, as if a dozen souls were fighting to escape its flesh. It turned hollow, soulless eyes toward him and grinned with too many mouths. "Join us." A scream built in Grant's throat, but he never had the chance to release it. The shelves surged forward, collapsing around him, swallowing him whole. He fought, but unseen hands grabbed his arms, his legs, his throat, dragging him down into the abyss. The faces in the jars watched, their eyes filled with silent terror as he disappeared into the darkness. Then, silence. The store reset. The shelves stood tall once more, the jars back in place, pristine and untouched. The lights buzzed softly, casting an artificial glow over the undisturbed aisles. And on one of the shelves, among the hundreds of other souls, sat a new jar. Inside, Officer Grant pounded against the glass, his screams unheard, his fate sealed. Outside, the world moved on, oblivious. The abandoned store remained as it always had, forgotten by time. But its hunger was endless. It waited. And when the next unfortunate soul wandered through its doors, the cycle would begin again.